Welcome to the INFOWARS Nightly News. I'm David Knight, and it's Monday, April 13th, 2015. Here are our top stories.
Tonight, the Bundy Ranch, 1 year later. Then, troops trained to take on sovereign citizens. And it's official. Hillary announces her presidential run.
You say that Hillary Clinton is a witch and that she's not going to be good for the United States. As a white male who basically owns the entire world, you should be depopulated.
Well,
it's ridiculous. Hillary's going to win.
Listen, you're a god, Smitty.
Well, HRC kicked off her campaign this weekend. I guess that's her Royal Clinton. And she kicked it off with a doozy of a typo. According to Bloomberg Politics, they say her first typo of the 2016 campaign is a doozy, and this is what she said. She said she's fought children and their families all her career. Well, I couldn't agree more. Was that a typo? Was it maybe a Freudian slip? Maybe it was the campaign letter that was meant for her globalist cronies. Nevertheless, it's true. Just take a look at one of the things she's famous for. It takes a village. No, it doesn't take a community. It doesn't take a government to raise children. It takes a family. And of course, Hillary Clinton and her husband's policies have been unfriendly to the family even before the children are born, pushing abortion and then taking away our choices as far as how they're going to be educated, whether or not they're going to be vaccinated. I'm sure you'll find her on the anti-choice side of that issue. But as they point out, it went viral before they fixed it on the Drudge Report. He pointed that out to everyone. Now, I think maybe her slogan that says, "Are you ready for Hillary?" Maybe that should be, "Are you ready for hypocrisy?" And the story from Infowars.com today, Paul Joseph Watson points out, Hillary vows to protect Americans from the 1% while being funded by the 1%. That's hypocrisy for you. He says, out of the top 20 contributors to Hillary in 2008, 6 were banks: J.P. Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, and crucially, Lehman Brothers and Goldman Sachs, 2 of the institutions directly implicated in the 2008 financial crash, which left millions of Americans financially destitute. And let me just stop here for a second and remind everybody that the too big to fail banks got that way because of Bill Clinton's administration. They were the ones who approved the landmark merger between Bank of America and Nations Bank, the largest merger ever seen. Nobody thought that would go through, but when it did, it was off to the races. And very quickly, all the banks began to consolidate in order to survive. That was one of the things that drove this bubble that burst in 2008. Paul goes on to say, making up the rest of the top 20 were law firms as well as monolithic corporations like Time Warner, Microsoft, and GE. Almost all these entities will again contribute to Hillary for her 2016 campaign because, as we've said before, an election is an advanced auction of stolen goods. If you want to see the entire list of the people who are in that auction right now, that's in that article from Paul Joseph Watson. And of course, it's no better on the side of Jeb Bush. He spent this last weekend going before the NRA and touting his 6-pack of freedom. Well, before you can swallow that 6-pack of freedom, I think you need to down an entire 6-pack. No, it's absolute hypocrisy on his side as well. Listen to what he's trumpeting here before the NRA. He says, number 1, he passed a law while he was governor of Florida to make it easier for hunters and fishermen to register to vote. How does that affect our freedom in the Second Amendment? Then he goes on, number 2, a law establishing a baseline number of acres of public hunting land. Do you start to get the idea that Jeb Bush thinks the Second Amendment is about sporting? It's not about sporting. But even worse, he continues on. He says, a law prohibiting the confiscation of firearms following hurricanes. How about a law prohibiting the confiscation of firearms, period? Oh, that's right, we already have it. It's called the Second Amendment. Then he goes, number 4, a law to restrict non-law enforcement access to records on concealed carry licenses. Well, one of the reasons that law enforcement is keeping that information is because they have turned our rights into privileges, having us get a permit to carry guns. He goes on with number 5 and 6 are essentially the same thing. A law ensuring Florida citizens had the right to carry firearms for self-defense and other lawful purposes while in the national forests and state parks in Florida. Why would you limit it to that? That's not in the Constitution. That's not part of our God-given rights that are recognized by the Constitution. And then finally, in 6, he says, a law to assist men and women who are in the military in renewal of their concealed weapons and firearm licenses, because, you know, Jeb Bush is all about turning a right into a government-granted privilege. So much for his 6-pack of freedom. You want to know what real freedom looks like? Real freedom is not given. Real freedom is always taken. And 1 year ago, the community around the Bundy Ranch took that freedom. They stood up in a determined way to the people who were there unlawfully, in violation of posse comitatus. An army of federal bureaucrats had descended upon the area, not working through law enforcement and brutalizing the people of that area. They stood up for each other and they stood down the federal government. We're going to play you a clip of that in just a moment. But first, I want to take a look at how the press is predictably spinning this still a year later. A couple of progressive outlets here. We have Climate Progress says 1 year later, Cliven Bundy and his right-wing militia are still trying to seize public lands. No, it was never about them seizing public lands. It was always about his grazing rights. And if you want to talk about who are good stewards of public land, maybe you ought to take a look at what John McCain is doing in Arizona, Climate Progress. There he is taking lands that were turned over by treaty to the public, to the Indians, a sacred area, a historical area, an area for the public to use. He's turning that over to be completely devastated for the benefit of a foreign corporation, pretty much along the lines of the Agenda 21 crony capitalism that Harry Reid was involved in all up and down Nevada. And of course, that was what Cliven Bundy, the last rancher standing, they had to get him out of the way so they could get mitigation for where they wanted to put their other projects. But he had rights. He had property rights, his grazing rights, as well as water rights, as well as people who have even mineral rights. Those are rights that are sold by the government, by the federal government, to individuals. That is real property. But of course, they don't want to allow that. They use the excuse of an endangered species, the desert tortoise, and the BLM grabbed those tortoises and then eventually euthanized them, saying they didn't have the money to feed them. Yet they had the money for an army to descend upon that area. No, the federal government is not the best steward of the land. It can be done far better, I believe. There's still issues. We still have to have oversight, but the public lands, I think, can be overseen by the public at the local level far better than it can be done at a distant Washington, D.C. bureaucracy. Now, this is the way that Salon spun it. They put a racist spin on this. Guess what? This is what they say this is what a white supremacy looks like. A party at the Bundy Ranch and a funeral in North Charleston. So what they do is they try to tie together this 1 year anniversary party that they had at the Bundy Ranch where they served everybody barbecue, welcomed the public. They try to tie that with the shooting in North Charleston. Try to say that because it worked there, it was an example of white privilege. Nothing could be farther from the truth. I'm going to point out the differences between the failed demonstrations in Ferguson and what happened here, and it has nothing to do with white privilege. But then they also try to take the extremist Jared Miller and his wife Amanda. They say they traveled to the Bundy Ranch only to be turned out, but they would go on to execute 2 Nevada police officers in June. They took it upon themselves to be the vanguard of the Bundy Rebellion. So even though they do mention briefly that they were thrown out, they don't give any credit to the people there at the Bundy Ranch standoff to police the outside agitators in their midst, the provocateurs, and throw them out. Instead, they try to tie them, as we saw Harry Reid and others do. And they go on to say, in the end, the 2 officers were the only casualties. And Bundy's boys went home with not so much as a Band-Aid as federal agents were backed down by a veritable army of militiamen. That, ladies and gentlemen, they say, is white power. No, it is not. It is the power of the community. The community came together. They managed it very well there. There's a lesson to be learned, and it's not one of racism. It's how can we stand up as a community in the power of the community, posse comitatus, to do the right thing, to protect each other, even when law enforcement, who has the responsibility, won't exercise that responsibility, even when the federal government breaks posse comitatus and acts in an unlawful and unconstitutional manner. Here's that full report that we put together.
Sheriff, this is what we the people are asking this morning. disarm the Park Service.
We're faced with a decision to either get the cattle or be the cattle.
But we're staying here until they're gone.
We want those arms picked up, don't we?
The crowd is now moving forward toward the barrier. The police have been telling everybody they are going to shoot if we don't move back.
As we approach the 1-year anniversary of the standoff at the Bundy Ranch, I want to take another look at what happened, especially in light of the lies and slander from media like Glenn Beck and the dangerous characterization by Obama, Harry Reid, Homeland Security, that labeled the community standing together against brutality as domestic terrorists. On April 7, 2014, Paul Joseph Watson wrote an article, Armed Feds Prepare for Showdown with Nevada Cattle Rancher, with the subtitle, Ruby Ridge-Style Standoff Brewing, as Bundy says he's prepared to be killed. The property rights dispute had been going on for decades, but now things were beginning to come to a head. Hundreds of federal officials, aided by helicopters, low-flying aircraft, hired cowboys, began rounding up Bundy's cattle the preceding weekend as Bundy accused them of trespassing. And as supporters from the local community and protesters headed to the area to demand that the feds back off, the BLM had created a First Amendment area out in the middle of nowhere where demonstrators could voice their concerns, but nowhere else. This area right here, this small area here, was cordoned off with orange temporary like construction barriers marked for the free speech zone. It just shows you how quickly your free speech zones can disappear. When you allow them to be contained to a very small area, it's gone. But we're here and we want to tell the BLM something about how upset we are with what's going on here, but there's no government agency here to listen to us. That's the whole reason you don't confine people to remote areas from what's happening. Not only had the federal agents been confiscating Bundy's cattle, they had also set up agents with sniper rifles, pointed at the ranchers, pointed at the protesters. The crowd had been building throughout the week, and on Saturday there was a huge crowd. To defuse it, the sheriff came in the morning to address the crowd and tell them that the powers that be had graciously consented to allow the last rancher remaining in business in the area to continue grazing. Never mind that he had had most of his cattle rustled by the army of BLM contractors for the past several weeks.
With that being said, I believe a press release has already been put forth that the BLM is going to cease this operation. The Gold Butte allotment will be reopened to the public.
Much to the surprise of the sheriff, Bundy said that wasn't good enough.
The sheriff, this is what we the people are asking this morning. Disarm the Park Service.
Right.
At Lake Mead and Red Rock Park and all other parks that the federal government claims they have jurisdiction over. Take your county bulldozers and loaders and tear down the entrance places, where they ticket us and where they enter us and make us citizens pay their fees. You take down you get the county equipment out there and tear those things down this morning.
Yes, sir.
What they wanted was for him to exercise his authority as the only lawful law enforcement in the area and to disarm the BLM agents and contractors who had been pointing their sniper rifles at the protesters and ranchers, confiscate their weapons, tell them to leave the area, and then stack the weapons on stage. Bundy gave him 1 hour to do so. At the end of the time limit, Bundy announced that it looked like the sheriff wasn't going to do anything. No one was surprised. But what did surprise us, and surprise the Federals, was his announcement.
I guess he's not coming, so I guess we had presents. We thought we had a sheriff here, but evidently we don't have a sheriff here. We're going to go and take the rest of them out of the compound trails up here above the freeway.
I was one of the